Hello and welcome back. So, in my first several videos, I would make occasional reference to political and cultural issues and themes. These are things I want to start digging into more. I've got plans for a lot of upcoming episodes. One will be on alt media bias and audience capture, why I used to trust Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, but don't particularly trust them very much anymore, and why it's very important to have friends who disagree with you. That's going to be one episode. I'm also going to be doing an episode on why many of us start off left-leaning but become more conservative as we get older. And then I'm going to start doing episodes looking at particular issues that are contentious and looking at them from both left and right perspectives, not just one. But before I get into that, I thought it would be a good idea to give you, the viewer, a better impression of where I'm coming from. So I used to be a very ardent progressive. I wasn't an extreme leftist. Like, I was moderate, but I was ardent. And I also identified as a feminist because I believed that, in equality. And, I watched the Young Turks probably 6-7 hours a week, every single week. Cenk Uygur was literally my hero. Not anymore. I don't watch TYT at all anymore, and and I don't miss them. But I was a huge fan. I once had a friend throw a birthday party themed for me after Cenk and the Young Turks. This was back in 2011, and I loved it. So in terms of positions, so basically, unless I say otherwise, I was and am all of these things. Pro-choice, pro-gay rights, like pro-civil union or gay marriage. My only issue is I didn't want to force and don't want to force churches or any kind of religious institution to perform a service that they morally have a problem with. But I want to make sure that gay people have full access to marriage or civil union. Pro-free speech, pro-separation of church and state, anti-religious. That has changed. No longer anti-religious. Pro-affordable, accessible, quality healthcare and education. Pro-net neutrality. Pro-equality of opportunity regardless of one's demographics. Pro-campaign finance reform, and also very much wanting to change the regulations so as to make it very difficult for politicians to receive favors for doing political favors for donors. So things like preventing them from becoming lobbyists, or getting big fancy jobs at corporations that they've done policies relevant to after, things like that. These were positions that I had, and I was also I was in favor of a responsibly administered social safety net. More broadly, and just in terms of my life, I was raised by my mom, who was a single mom and a refugee immigrant to Canada from East Africa. I was raised primarily by my mom and my grandmother. My father was useless. My mom was and is strong and independent. I went on to study psychology, a field that is mostly female. Half my advisors were women. I went into occupational therapy, a field that is probably close to 90% female. For the first handful of years of my career, most of my bosses were women, and I worked in nursing homes, which were employed like 90+% by women. You know what I mean. So the reason I mention all that is because one of the big cultural issues that led to this shift was about feminism. But anyhow, on top of that, I was from a progressive city, Toronto, and a progressive country, Canada, and I went to a very progressive university, the University of Toronto. I disliked the right, and I thought that the left was the primary home of reason. So I was quite on the left, and it's rather impressive that the left managed to lose me, because you would think that I'd be someone who, it's like, how do you lose this person? He's right up your alley. But they did. My transition away from the left started in 2013 in a culture war in the atheist community that would eventually repeat itself in the gaming community and then in the culture at large. This was basically when feminism and racial social justice kind of issues started gaining a very prominent place in discussion in this atheist community. The most significant movement representing this was called Atheism Plus, which basically meant atheism plus we care about, basically minorities, we're anti-transphobia, anti-misogyny, anti-racism, all that kind of thing. And this movement took off on the left in good part because if you were to, or not on the left, but in the atheist community, a lot of atheists are or recently were university students, and so these sorts of views were very common and being developed in the university communities. And the thing with the atheist community was that it was overwhelmingly male and almost as overwhelmingly white. But this was never by design, right? So they viewed this, the more like feminist leaning people, like they viewed this as a problem and as being evidence of sexism or racism and things like that. When, like, at least from my perspective, that was never it. Like, I did not like that the atheist movement was mostly male because, I was an atheist in my 20s and, I wanted to meet a girl and it'd be nice to meet someone who had like similar views to me on things that were important to me. So I wanted there to be more women there. And as far as racial things, it's like, well, the atheist community did and does hold Ayaan Hirsi Ali in extremely high regard. Except for the more social justice leaning ones now who reject her for other reasons. There was a rapper, a YouTube rapper named Graydon Square, who was embraced enthusiastically when he started making raps about atheism. So it wasn't like we were opposed to having non-straight white males in the movement. It's just that straight white males were the ones disproportionately coming in. And in my experience, when people that did not fit these demographics came in, so like women, for example, and people of other racial demographics came in, like all I ever saw was them being welcomed just as much as anyone else would be welcomed. So there began to be increasingly frequent accusations of racism, sexism, and other sorts of bigotry, which were very often, in my experience, unfounded. But many people in the atheist community who weren't paying enough attention to see the details here believed it. Because you have this person who is claiming to be sort of like an oppressed person and or standing in support of the oppressed, who is showing moral outrage and making accusations of negative, like oppressive kind of behavior. And most people, like, for a long time, they're going to think, yeah, like where there's smoke, there's probably fire. And so you'd have this small minority of like extreme people in the social justice side that would make big stinks about things that were often very small, or they would just take the most specific and selectively taken angle on things, like the one that was the least charitable, and just jump on that. But it's not like everyone was that extreme. It's like there were plenty of moderates, but the thing is that most of the moderates were afraid to say anything about these people, the more extreme people, because they didn't want to like open themselves up for accusations of racism or bigotry, sexism, things like that. And then also, I think it's like they were also giving them the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time. It's like, oh, like, even if they're being unreasonable, it's like, like they've dealt with a lot in their life, it makes sense, or like they probably just a lot of times figure they must have a valid perspective because they're really mad right now, and people tend not to get mad for bad reasons. And so when issues would come up, like discussions, disagreements over issues in this category, like, like for example, like the gender wage gap, something like that, there would, it's like it was impossible to disagree with them and have your disagreement be valid. It's like if you disagree that the wage gap is evidence of 100%, that's sexism, you were liable to be told that your disagreement is clear-cut evidence of your bigotry or your privilege-based ignorance. There was no valid disagreement. You would often be accused of gaslighting, which means that you basically someone actually has a valid problem that they're justifiably complaining about, and you're saying, no, it's all in your head, there is no problem, like, why do you think this? You're making something out of nothing. That's gaslighting, and that's the accusation that would often get thrown. I remember like talking to, there was like a moderate feminist in my atheist group, and she was a lawyer, and she once told me that like as feminists, she said we are taught never to back down. And like to me, that's ridiculous. That basically means that no matter how much you are not doing well in an argument, no matter how many of your points get effectively challenged, nothing will change your mind. And so that was quite disturbing to me, especially coming from someone who was not extreme. And so because of all this kind of thing, I started looking into feminism more. Like I had for years taken it for granted that, the gender wage gap is a sexism based thing. That, women are kind of like often like second class citizens, all that stuff. I bought it. And so that's why I was a feminist, because I'm like, well, we shouldn't have that. But so then I started looking into things. And I started noticing, it really does seem that feminism hyper-emphasizes cases where women are or can be at least perceived to be at a disadvantage, or where men are or could be perceived to be at an advantage, while completely or almost completely ignoring the contrary. I looked into the gender wage gap and found that when you start controlling for the various variables that contribute to differences in income, like, your education, the career field, how many years straight you've worked, did you relocate for work, have you had interruptions in your career, how many hours a week do you work? When you start looking at all those kinds of things, the gap shrinks to like 5 cents. No more than 77 cents. It's like the 23-cent disparity goes to 5. And then I started noticing a lot of dishonest coverage on left sources when it came to things like, black men being killed by police officers. Like, it was so frequent that the stories were presented to make the black person look maximally innocent and the officer maximally guilty and maximally racist, and it was often done dishonestly. And then my transition was furthered even more by watching Cenk Uyghur's interviews on the Young Turks with Karen Strawn, who is absolutely fantastic. I completely recommend her. Her YouTube channel is called Girl Writes What. She's just brilliant. So she had an interview with Cenk, and he was ridiculous. And then Cenk's big interview with Sam Harris, where like I lost so much respect in these two interviews for Cenk, and I just saw how like he was being deliberately obtuse and dishonest repeatedly. So you see like a lot of like things are really, they're all crumbling down. My views of the atheist community as being this place of reason and a place where you're not entitled to not be offended, all those things were falling apart, and it was because of like far left activists in our community that were doing it. My hero Cenk had fallen from grace. A lot had changed, so that's when I left the left. And so and I know a lot of people went through this too. Like, I have friends who went through a very similar trajectory as did I. And this played out later, and from like let's see, this all occurred between like roughly 2012 to 2015 in the atheist community. By the way, the atheist community never recovered from this. Then it like happened again in GamerGate, where gaming journalists hid behind accusations of sexism in order to deflect criticism against corruption in gaming media. And then it took over the entire culture during the Trump campaign and his subsequent presidency. So in all of these cases, you had this culture war between people, on the one hand, who view any sort of minority group, excluding Jewish and Asian people, as being these noble victims of oppression who need special protections and special help and should rarely be asked to do anything for themselves other than point the finger outward. And if you doubt this, if it seems to you like I'm being too strong in what I'm saying, just think about this. Can you list one thing that you would recommend if you're on the left, if you would recommend black people to do to improve their own standing as individual people and in their own like families and in their own communities, and not things like protesting. Like I'm not saying that we should only do one thing. Yeah, I'm all about consciousness raising against racism. I'm about, like, I would say class-based and opportunity-based affirmative action, not race-based. But even then, because there are more black people of lesser opportunity, they'll disproportionately get it. But the thing is I could like give a variety of things that I could say that anybody could do to improve their well-being, and that includes many people in the black community. Like, for example, single-parent homes. That's more common in the black community. That's something. So, but if like, I've tried this before. I've tried asking people on the left, like when talking about Black Lives Matter, I will fully grant, like, let's raise consciousness against racism and all that kind of stuff. Let's do all that good stuff. But also, it's like, at the end of the day, no one's going to advocate for you the way you are. You are the biggest factor most of the time in what you can achieve in life. Like, it's not that nothing else matters, but like, you are a huge factor, and we cannot ignore that. But whenever I have tried to get someone to like say what people from this minority could do, it could be women too, like on income, right? I don't get an answer. Like, I've had people refuse to answer it even after being asked 4 times. It's like, I got the impression, I'm like, it really does seem like some of these more social justice leading people, they seem to view these protected classes as being somewhere between human and house pet. But by contrast, they often seemed to view straight white men as being somewhere between human and superhero. Not only were people in this group of people expected to take personal responsibility for their own lives, which, fair enough, we all should. But it went further than that. They were told to take personal responsibility for their own unconscious biases. Okay, fair enough, and the like. But also, they were expected to basically be actively and strongly involved in righting the wrongs of history, fixing all of society's problems, and so forth. So on the one hand, it's like, you try and ask some of these people what's something that like a woman or a black person could do to improve their situation, they won't say anything. But when you like ask this, what can like white people or straight white men or whatever do to help them, there's a whole laundry list of things. Or consider, like, there was, remember that back around 2013, 14-ish, there was the big issue about consent, sexual consent. And there'd be discussions on things like what happens if a male and a female have some drinks and they have sex. It would often be said that he raped her because she was not able to give consent because she'd been drinking. Well, but the thing is that so had he. And so once again here, we almost have like this feminist patriarchal position where the woman in the exchange cannot be expected to take any personal responsibility for herself at all, but the man has to take personal responsibility for himself and for her. It really is interesting when things could go so extreme in one way that they horseshoe back to meet the other extreme on the other side. So that's one side of the culture war. And then, on the other hand, there was a mixture of people who had been center-left, moderate, center-right, or just flat-out right, who thought that the people that I just described were engaged in victimhood, lionizing, cry-bullying, who just wanted to be... And these people, like the people that were disagreeing with the social justice activists, they just wanted to be able to talk about what they wanted to talk about, joke about what they wanted to joke about, question and analyze and assess beliefs regardless of how sacred they are to somebody. This was very popular in the atheist community prior to social justice. And really, a great number of these people were basically people that they actually believed in Martin Luther King's dream of people being judged based on the content of their character, not based on their race or and by extension, other demographic issues. So back then, like I'd say from like 2006 or so to like 2012, 13, if 0 was maximally left and 100 was maximally right, and 50 was just dead moderate, I would have put myself probably somewhere in the low 40s. Now I would say that I consider myself to be center right. and I put myself in the low 60s. So still moderate, but on the other side of the curve. And so why did I shift? Well, for one thing, the character of the two sides had changed. Like, I used to be in the left because I wanted to see people judged based on their character, not their demographics. I was a strong advocate of free speech and the belief that no one has the right not to be offended. It is for these reasons, though, that I now feel more at home on the moderate right than I do on the left. I perceive far greater tolerance for my views when they go contrary to many people on the right than, like, here's an example. I would way rather say to a person on the right that I happen to be pro-choice than say to a person on the left that I happen to be pro-life. And this is not everybody, okay? So I should be more clear, because there's lots of moderates on both sides. In fact, that's most of us. But like, basically, all in all, like, generally speaking, more often than not, I will be better received on the right these days when I make one of those statements. That doesn't mean that there are not censorious people on the right. Like, I lost like Trump Truth Social, like, one of the it's supposed to be this free speech thing, right? Well, no, it's like you can't even criticize Truth Social, like, utterly hypocritical. Same thing with the pillow guy, like, they were talking all about free speech, but like when they make up their own platforms, they're the first ones to institute speech rules. And likewise, there are people on the left who, like, I would fit in with great, like people like Kyle Kalinske and Jimmy Dore. Like, they are very tolerant of disagreement and very open, and so there are exceptions on both sides, no question about it. I also prefer the right's greater emphasis on personal responsibility and strong supportive families and communities over the more common emphasis on the left of oppressor and victim narratives and expectations that government or other people are primarily accountable for solving the problems of individuals of certain groups. And then I've also had a shift in some perspectives. I have a much more positive attitude towards religion now, whereas before it was almost maximally negative. And that's something I'm going to be talking about a lot on this channel too, is the importance of community. I have come to see the importance of being careful when making social changes, because we may not be aware of the functions of the current structures. We may not realize they're performing certain functions that we don't notice, and that by removing those things, those functions are being disturbed. There could unintended consequences of the actions. I was shown an example of this recently by a new friend on Discord, and he talked about the Jewish law where you cannot drive on the Sabbath. So what that had the impact of doing was, since you can't drive on the Sabbath, you must live within walking distance of the synagogue or the temple. And so what that does is it establishes a community of Jewish people that live close to the temple and therefore close to each other. Very good for community. And so it's like if the Jews were to change the rule about the car thing, because it's not very, it's very outdated, it's kind of oppressive. Well, it's like they may wonder in 30 years why their communities are not nearly as strong as they used to be. But it's not just that. So yes, I've shifted in some ways, somewhat. But I think really a big thing as to why I've shifted, though, is because the issues have changed. The culture has changed. What made a person left or right in 2010, they're not the same thing as what makes them left or right now. So, like, for example, back then, if you supported gay marriage, like, that was highly diagnostic of you being on the left. It wasn't a 100% guarantee, but it was probably true. Whereas now, especially if you're talking to people like below the age of 45 or something, Democrat or Republican, like, it's no longer this big wedge issue. Yes, there are going to be more people on the right to this day that are against gay marriage, but there are so many that are totally fine with it. But this issue has been supplanted actually now by the issues of, like the transgender issue, which is a very different set of issues. And when you have a new issue, sometimes people resort themselves, which seems to have happened here. Another difference is the party's perspectives or relationships with science. So as I said before, I really did believe that the left was the primary home of reason and also science, like in the context of things like creationism, global warming, denialism, all that kind of thing. It was very easy to think that. But now it's like, I don't think either party has a claim at all to being like the party of science, because if you find a creationist, they're more likely to be on the right, things like that. But there are anti-vaxxers on both sides, and I don't mean anti-COVID vaxxers. That's a different category of thing. I mean people that are anti-vax. Period. There's those on both sides. You've got people on the left pretending to not being able to tell you what a woman is. Things like that. Like, each side has their blemishes when it comes to like their beliefs with respect and how their beliefs correspond with science. Another change is that the Christian right is not nearly as loud and active and influential as they were back during the Bush years, for example. And so being pro-separation of church and state is not as diagnostic of left and right as it used to be, I don't believe. And then on the issues of like participation in unnecessary wars, well, both parties are greatly blemished in this regard. So that's basically a wash. The issues have changed, and in many ways the characters of the parties have changed. And then I've changed somewhat in some ways too, but I do think the overwhelming change is for the first two reasons. So what are my positions right now? Well, for one, I have far greater respect for religious wisdom and community, far greater respect for modesty when it comes to making changes. That's another, we talked about unintended consequences, things like that, and like that we might not always realize the functions that a certain social institution is performing. I believe that Western nations very much need to actively engage in strategic immigration. If a person is like relatively young and like, they're educated, or they have something else about them that shows that they have a hunger to achieve and succeed, whether they be from Nigeria, India, Korea, wherever, if they have that fire in their belly and they basically like they hold Western liberal, like not like as in like like Western liberal, not liberal as in like leftist, but Western liberal values, we want them. Like the West and like most of the rest of the world a lot of the rest of the world has not had enough kids, and so we need talented, hardworking people. However, immigration should be done in a way that is measured, right? Like, we don't want to have too much too fast, because it could be too much of a shock to the system. So, and if too much change happens, it can cause problems. And so it's like, think about it this way. Like, if you're Canadian and you were born and raised in Canada, you are used to and accustomed to and comfortable in Canadian cultural practices. And there's nowhere else you can get those but in Canada. So if Canada starts diluting, if those start getting diluted out by other people, right, like really quickly, you've got nowhere to go to rescue your values. And if this seems like xenophobic or things like that, just think of it this way. Imagine if there was a person from, some rural area in Mexico that traditional Mexican area, but then it starts getting developed for tourism. And so all these fancy hotels start getting put in there. A lot of English speaking gets started. You start seeing McDonald's and Starbucks all over the place. Like, how many of us would be calling Mexican residents there who do not like that their culture is being diluted and taken away from them, and their way of living and like everything they've ever known is being radically changed? Like, I don't think any of us would have anything but sympathy for them. And so I think we owe that to our own people too. Relatedly, I believe that every country in the world has a right to defend their borders and to choose who they allow in. That is not racist. That is not anything like that necessarily. But it's, a country, I think, has a right to do that. If we have, for example, like we like social funding of various kinds of programs like roads, bridges, healthcare, education, things like that, it matters that we control who comes in and who and so forth. So that's a fair thing. I also believe that we should be very aware of the serious negative social and psychological consequences of relocation, frequent job and school switching, and not participating in community. I believe that people should be judged based on the content of their character, not their demographics. I believe that women and men are not the same thing. We differ on average in our strengths and our weaknesses and in our interests. There are plenty of men, of course, who have more typically feminine orientations than plenty of women, and vice versa. But while there should be equality of opportunity, we should not expect there to be equality of outcome. Yes, there are some women that are more kind of boisterous than a lot of men, and some men that are maybe more kind of agreeable than a lot of women. But we should not expect these things to be equally common on both sides. We should not expect, like, yes, there are going to be some women who like and are great at math, but we should not expect there to be as many of them as men, and so we should not assume sexism in the tech world if there's an overrepresentation of males there. I believe that the gender wage gap is rooted in dishonest propaganda, and when you calculate it fairly, the gap goes very close to zero. I believe that a person should be free to get sexual reassignment surgery. I've got no problem whatsoever on Elliot Page. But I do think we should be encouraging extreme caution about this, because we're talking about, as a book has referred to it, irreversible damage. And this goes triple, quadruple for minors. With few exceptions, I think that male to female transgender individuals should not be allowed to compete against biological females, and they should never be able to hold records for females. There can be some exceptions, not to the records, but to the participation. So, for example, in mixed martial arts, if a woman fighter is willing and wants to fight, like a man or a male to male to female transgender person, and that person wants to fight them, then yeah, I got no problem. I just don't want the women to be forced to face these male to female transgenders people. On the other hand, I believe that trans people are people, and no one disagrees with that. I hope that we will treat everyone else the way we would hope that we would be treated. So in the case of transgender individuals, I would hope that individuals would treat them the way they would want to be treated if they had some sort of controversial, highly infrequent difference from the broader population. I hope we would extend the same courtesy as we would hope to receive. Now, of course, I'm not talking about law here, like requiring it. I'm just saying general social standards. As I said, I do not believe people have a right not to be offended. So I don't want laws against, offensive speech of any category. But I think this is something that, should fall under like social kind of social regulation, not formal legal and criminal regulation. I believe gay marriage and civil union are more than okay. I am still pro-choice. And while it is sometimes warranted to look at how social structures can undeservedly harm some people, and that these structures sometimes need to be changed, we should never forget that usually the single most important factor in improving the life of an individual or group is the actions of the person or group themselves. And we cannot de-emphasize that. I'm not saying that's the whole game, but it is a critical part of the game. I believe that too much financial inequality is dangerous, as it corrupts democracy, exacerbates divisions, and can create an underclass of people who are so resentful and disloyal of their society. And this can lead to basically just, like in extreme cases, terrorism, Columbine kind of situations. And the solution for this, though, is not just top down. It's not just give them all money. That I think is part of it, is that kind of thing. Like opportunity-based affirmative action, for example, things like that. But there's a role for like the top, but there's also roles for the middle and the bottom. We all have roles to play, and so we need to, I think, encourage and instill a culture of interpersonal support, but also of taking personal responsibility and of recommitting to a well-integrated family. And lastly, I still believe in campaign finance reform and strict anti-corruption regulations, so that our politicians represent us, not those who fund them. So now you've heard a little bit about where I was and where I am now, and why the transition occurred. I hope you'll come back for upcoming episodes on the topics of the political angles I mentioned at the top of this video. I can only imagine that a lot of the people watching this video can relate to the experience I went through as a disaffected liberal on the left. If you have similar experiences or different ones, feel free to share them in the comments section. If you have any disagreements, feel free to share those. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one, and thanks for watching.